Since the earliest days of the Church, Christians have struggled with how to understand Old Testament law. While the Apostle Paul is adamant that all of Scripture is inspired and useful, the First Church Council of Jerusalem convened because of the issues involving the law. There was still a lot of questions. Over the next few centuries, many Christians began either to reject the Old Testament completely or make it allegorical as a way to find something meaningful without the uncomfortable task of wrestling with literal meaning. One early writer, for example, interpreted the food laws in Deuteronomy 14:7 in the following way. The clean animal symbolizes a true Christian who's able to both chew the cud, that's meditate on the word, and be cloven-footed, that is, walk in the world while not being corrupted by it, and walk in the Spirit at the same time. Can we all agree on something? God's law, as revealed in the Old Testament, is daunting, it's uncomfortable, and it's confusing. But if the Bible is God's revelation to the world, then something about that revelation should give us a picture of who God is and what He calls us to do. Laws reflect the giver of the law. It's important that we understand God's laws so that we don't misunderstand God. As with all forms of communication, there's at least three crucial aspects of laws that we must remember. First, every law has a context. One summer, my 5-year-old discovered he could reach into our small outdoor pond and pet the goldfish, as he put it. After buying more goldfish, I had to put some rules in place to protect the new arrivals. The circumstances brought about a new law in my house. So every law has a context. Second, every law has content. In this case, the content of my new law was, Vincent, don't pet the goldfish. And then third, there's a purpose or a reason for the law. My purpose was twofold. I wanted the goldfish to live, that's the first part, but I also wanted my son to learn a valuable lesson about life. I had an immediate goal of stopping a particular action in a particular context, but on a much deeper level, I wanted my son to learn boundaries, self-control, and respect. I wanted my son to become a man. So the content of Old Testament laws is simply the laws themselves. And we can run into trouble when we just stop there. Don't mix seeds in a field? Well, that's stupid. Kill children who hit their dad? That seems pretty unreasonable. Sure, if we stop with just the content, the text is going to push us away every time. But the content doesn't occur in a vacuum. There's a context there that clarifies language and social dynamics and what the original audience heard and what they understood. There's a broader purpose that helps us to understand the laws as they're situated inside of much broader goals. The context of the Old Testament laws is the ancient Near East. Why were the Israelites not supposed to get tattoos? Are tattoos inherently evil? Or is there something about the cultural and historical context that matters at that time and in that place? The overall purpose of the Old Testament law is to show God's people how to be holy. Holy simply meaning to be separate or set apart in a way that teaches others something about God. I believe God intended for Old Testament law to help form the kind of people who embody the community of God on earth. And by so doing, it shows the character of God. I'm not suggesting that every law will suddenly make sense as we look at Old Testament law this way. I'm also not claiming that what I have to say will answer all your questions. I still have some myself. I simply ask that we consider the possibility that the God of the Old Testament is often misunderstood and misrepresented, and that a clearer understanding of the content, context, and purpose of the law may be helpful in forming a clearer view of God. The law in the Old Testament stresses holiness in every aspect of life. The key aspect of holiness, once again, is that of separateness. God, and by extension His people, are to be holy. They're called out, they're called away from things that could corrupt them. The purpose of the law was to create a wholeness or a unity within the community of Israel and a distinctiveness from the surrounding cultures. This idea of separateness goes back to Genesis 1. Over and over, God separates and categorizes the natural world. Genesis 1 brims with the language of dividing, gathering, and classifying. That orderliness reflects a fundamental reality of creation. There's a nature to things such that they flourish inside of boundaries. Without boundaries, there would be chaos. What's good for humanity's universe, that is, the ordering and the bounding, is apparently good for humanity also. God seems determined that every time his people did anything, they would be reminded of the order, the wholeness, and the completeness that is found in boundaries. We see an example of this in the Old Testament dietary laws. The law divided animals into 3 general spheres presented in Genesis 1 and then elucidated in Leviticus 11. First, there's land animals. They're 4-footed. They hop or they walk or they jump. They have split hooves and they chew the cud. Then there's water animals, and to be a water animal, you had to have scales and fins. Then there's air animals. That's birds that need 2 wings for flying, or insects, for example, but the insects needed to have 4 feet. Now, obviously, this isn't a scientific distinction. There's plenty of animals that don't fit neatly into these categories. I'm talking to you, platypus. However, this was generally helpful. It's a classification with which God could teach his people how to think through the issue of boundaries. They were clear-cut and easy to see. An animal that was clean in the Old Testament had all the defining characteristics of its class and no characteristics of any other. Animals that blurred the boundaries were unclean. They weren't, like we sometimes hear, necessarily unhealthy. Remember, there is a moral or a spiritual point being made with these distinctions. The Israelites then were only allowed to fill themselves with animals that were separate, that were unmixed, and that were distinct. This principle carries over into other areas of life. Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22, verses 9 to 11, prohibit mixed breeding of cattle and crops. They forbid clothing with mixed fibers. They forbid plowing with different kinds of animals yoked together. Men and women were not to wear clothes of the opposite sex. There was no sexual activity allowed outside the boundary of marriage. People were to honor boundary markers. So we see this principle over and over again. There's a stability intended for the world, a careful defining of the purpose so that life can be lived in fullness and freedom. There's a nature to things that must be affirmed. That was a key part of it. So there's light and there's dark. There's water and land. There's plants and there's animals and there's people. God's people learned that he had created things with a specific nature and purpose. Though it might seem ridiculously micromanaged to us, God was going to make sure that his people understood the necessity of boundaries. They could not sit down for a meal, get dressed, marry, or farm without being reminded that they too were made with a specific nature for a specific purpose. The law reminded the Israelites of their call to holiness, once again, separateness or distinctiveness, in the midst of surrounding cultures. So in the same way that things couldn't be mixed, worldviews and ideas of Israel were not to be mixed with those of surrounding cultures. The purpose of many Old Testament laws was to separate the culture of Yahweh from the culture of Baal or Dagon or Ra. So tattoos had religious significance, as did a particular trimming of hair and beards. New mothers had to stay away from the temple, a prohibition which was probably intended to distance the Israelites from surrounding fertility cults. There was no cooking a baby goat in its mother's milk. Well, the Canaanites practiced a fertility rite that required the cooking of a kid in its mother's milk. It's worth noting that this type of precise expectations from God was unprecedented in the ancient Near East. Rules were very specific, of course. You could see this in the Code of Hammurabi. But what the gods wanted was often a mystery. If something went poorly, people had to guess as to why the gods were unhappy. Not so with Yahweh. This law, as specific as it was, made God's expectations accessible. It's important to note that while the Israelite law was a solid move toward a better world, the laws were usually incremental instead of complete. The laws are intended to show what's often called a redemptive movement in the world. In Christian terms, this means God at times used progressive revelation to reveal truth. God was beginning a restorative work in a very broken world through a particular group of people, and this was the start of the process, not the finished product. We see in the New Testament what it's going to look like to move into that finished product. So on the issue of justice and mercy, Jesus himself taught that you have heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's citing Old Testament law, a law which was designed to limit punishment. But Jesus says, I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. In other words, in the Old Testament, they limited an overreaction when it came to justice or punishment. But now in the New Testament, Jesus is going, okay, that was a good first step, but there's another step. I need to talk to you about your hearts. In Deuteronomy 24, divorce is permitted. Though in Matthew 19, we read that it's clearly not God's ideal. In fact, this was kind of an accommodation because of the hardness of people's heart. We read later in the New Testament, husbands, you have to love your wife as Christ loved the church, which means give your life for her. In fact, Jesus would stress so strongly the enduring nature of marriage that at times his disciples wondered if it would be better not to marry if you really had to be that committed to it. So once again, the laws in the Old Testament put some boundaries in place around marriage that is moving it in the right direction. But it wasn't done back then. Jesus was showing what it was supposed to be like. Let's look at the issue of slavery. Offenses against slaves were offenses against people with value in the Old Testament, in sharp contrast with the other cultures of the time. In fact, in Exodus 21, the Israelites were to take a life for a life if a master killed a slave. That was unprecedented. If a slave was beaten and lost an eye or a tooth, that slave could be set free. Hammurabi had called for the death penalty for people who helped runaway slaves, but Israel offered to grant safe harbor to foreign runaway slaves. And then in Israel, every 7th year, there was granted a release to indentured servants. And when that happened, masters had to release slaves with generous provisions, all conducted with the right attitude for the slave's well-being as he enters into freedom. Deuteronomy 15:9 says, beware that there is no base thought in your heart, and your eye is not hostile toward your poor brother. We read in the book of Job, if I have denied justice to my slaves, that would be men servants and manservants, when they have had a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one form us both within our mothers? And then in the New Testament, they're encouraged to pursue freedom. In fact, when you see the story of Philemon, it's very clear this is what's happening. Christopher Wright wrote, the slave in Israel was given human and legal rights unheard of in its contemporary societies. Mosaic legislation offered a radical advance for ancient Near East cultures. According to the Anchor Bible Dictionary, we have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interest of their masters. God appears to have actively involved the Israelites in a movement that began, not completed, an individual and societal restoration. In the book of Philemon, we see where this trajectory is headed. All image bearers of God have value and dignity. There is no hierarchy of worth. All are equal in the eyes of God. When Jesus arrived, he explained what the fulfillment of the law actually looked like, which is one of the reasons Christian ethical systems build primarily from the person and the teaching of Christ, not from the 613 laws in the Old Testament. It's not that the Old Testament is to be discarded, but it can't be understood without seeing how Jesus and then the writers of the New Testament carefully moved the law beyond the temporal, incremental tablets and into the eternal fulfilled kingdom of God. I believe we can also see in the system of law that the way punishment and restoration worked was also used to foreshadow the message of the gospel. The list of punishments is daunting, that's for sure. Not the least of which is the death penalty for more things than we would use the death penalty for today. And that's probably putting it mildly. As we look at it more closely, I'll explain why I think the role of punishment in the Old Testament is often misunderstood and how it actually paves the way for the good news of the gospel. First of all, the Jewish nation who received the content of God's law believed that the primary purpose of God's law was restitution, rehabilitation, and atonement. Most of the punishments were not applied literally. This is clear throughout the record of Jewish writings. So an eye for an eye was never understood to call for the actual maiming of an offender. Rather, it required compensation for the value of a victim's lost eye. Likewise, concerning the death penalty, Jewish law contained many safeguards, 2 eyewitnesses of unquestionable character. There was a prohibition of circumstantial evidence and a rule against self-incrimination. You couldn't be testified against by family members. You had to show that there was premeditation in the act of crime before you could use the death penalty. You had to show that the criminal had been specifically warned prior to the crime. The criminal had to indicate a response to that warning and that he was fully aware of his deed and he was still determined to go through it. If you put all those together, in effect, this did away with the application of the death penalty. The Mishnah declared, the Sanhedrin that executes one person in 7 years is called murderous. Another rabbi says that this extends to one execution in 70 years. So this doesn't mean that the punishment was meaningless or that the crime was irrelevant. The punishment clearly attached a level of severity that God considered appropriate to the crime. But in every case but one, there is another way the penalty could be paid. A couple studies may be helpful. Exodus 21, verses 29 to 32, deals with a case where an ox gores another person to death due to negligence on the part of the owner. The penalty is death. Verse 29. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up and it kills a man or woman, the bull must be stoned and the owner also must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. Notice that provision is made for a monetary fine to be paid instead of execution. In response to a capital crime in 1 Kings 20, verse 39, the following sentence is announced: a life for a life. However, the immediate context shows what the complete sentence was. It will be your life for his life, or you must weigh out a talent of silver. In Towards an Old Testament Ethic by Walter Kaiser, he writes, there were some 16 crimes that called for the death penalty in the Old Testament. Only in the case of premeditated murder did the text say that the officials in Israel were forbidden to take a ransom or a substitute. This has widely been interpreted to imply that in all the other 15 cases, the judges could commute the crime deserving of capital punishment by designating a ransom or a substitute. I think we've done a disservice to the law by not seeing its role in paving the way for the coming of Christ. Galatians 3:24 says that the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ. Have we ever thought of the law this way? That it makes clear we do bad things, it tells us what we deserve, and then it gives us an example of a ransom or a substitute. When Jesus shows up to fulfill the law, he arrives in the midst of a people who understood the need for a ransom for our souls.